Today we're going to be talking about Sequencer, Unreal Engine's nonlinear cinematics and cinematic content authoring tool. I have already went ahead and downloaded the base project and opened it up. So here is the basic premise. There is a spaceship and you are supposed to create a landing cinematic for it. The sequence should be quite short, between 7 and 17 seconds, and it should use at least 3 cameras that are also animated. Let's get right to it. For that, let's create a new level sequence. To create this sequence, click the cinematics button in the main toolbar in the level editor and click the add level sequence option. Let's save it in the cinematics folder and let's call it s_landing. This will open up the sequencer window that I will be talking next to my content browser down here. It opened up the sequence that we just created and also added it to the level. If you have ever used tools like Adobe Premiere or DaVinci Resolve, then the basics should be somewhat familiar to you. To the top left here, we have the main toolbar. To the right, we have the breadcrumbs. This becomes useful when you're putting sequences inside other sequences, so you have a fast way to navigate back to your main sequence. To the left here, we have the tree view, and to the right, we have the dope sheet or track view. So let's add our ship to this sequence. For that, let's take a closer look at how the ship is set up. We have the main ship hull mesh that is the parent. To that are attached the 4 engines, the front right, the front left, the back left and the back right engine. And to those are attached the landing legs that you can use if you want to. Let's start by adding the actual hull mesh itself to our sequence. For that, let's click this green plus button and let's add an actor to the sequence. Because I have the ship hull mesh selected, it shows up here. In the tree view, we can see that our ship hull has one active track, that is the transform, which itself is composed of the location, rotation and scale tracks, which in turn are composed of their X, Y and Z components. Before we get to animating the ship, let's change one more thing. Let's click this 30 FPS button and let's change our show time as option to seconds. That way, instead of displaying the frames in this top area here, it will display the second value instead. I will be tackling this animation process outside in and actually start from the ending. For that, let's navigate around our track area. You can pan around by right-clicking and moving left to right. You can scroll in and out by holding down Control and using the scroll wheel. So let's zoom out a bit. You can move the playhead by just grabbing it and moving it around. At this 0 seconds marker, you can see this green vertical line. This is the start of the sequence. And on the right here, we can see this red vertical line. This is the end of the sequence. You can change them by just grabbing them on the top here and moving them left or right as you wish. In this case, I'm going to be moving the end marker to around 14 seconds. I am also going to be moving the playhead there, because the first pose we are going to define is going to be where the ship has actually landed already. So let's do that. There are several ways in which you can add keys. You can click the small circular plus button in here, or use the enter key as the tooltip says. Or if you have the actual track selected, you can also press S. I'll do it now. This added in the keys for location, rotation, as well as scale. Let me minimize scale for now. If you want to key these sections separately, you can do so. For that, let me just move the playhead a little bit. You can use Shift W to only create a key for the location, Shift E to only create a key for the rotation, and Shift R to only create a key for the scale. To move keys around, just left click and drag on them. To delete the key, you can use backspace or delete. You can also use box select. Now, having defined our end position for the ship, let's define its start position. For that, I'm going to move my playhead back to the beginning. And I'm going to move my ship somewhere out there. This seems like a decent enough start position, but let's also rotate it. For that, the local space controls might be better. You can use this button to toggle them or use the keyboard shortcut, which if using the English layout should be Ctrl plus tilde. This works. Let's add a key by pressing S. Also, because we're not going to use any squeeze or stretch or any other scaling on our ship, let's get rid of the scale track. For that, let's select the scale track and press delete. Having defined the start and end poses, let's move our playhead to the middle and let's see how this looks like. Right now my ship is going through the ground. To fix that, let's add another key here. But one more thing, if I have the transform track selected, I can also see its path in the world itself. And these small ticks, or the distance between them, will show us how fast the ship is moving. In the middle here, the distance is longer, so the ship is moving faster. And at the ends, the distance is smaller, so the ship is moving slower here. Back to our ship, let's move it up a little bit. And also make sure that it is actually facing the direction it is flying in. Again, S to add the transform keys. The trajectory from the start to this point seems fine, so let's start refining the end section. At this point, I want my ship to be closer to the landing area, so I'm going to be adding a new key here for that. Again, Ctrl tilde to move between local and world space transform tools. And S to add a key. Also, let's make it look like the ship is actually braking when it's trying to land. Again, press S to update the keys. Let's see how this looks like. You can enable playback by being active in the sequencer editor and pressing spacebar. This looks decentish, but let's add in one more keyframe between the last two. Let's take a look at how it looks like now. And let's add in another keyframe at around 10 seconds to orient our ship correctly. This should work a bit better. Also, let's add in another key at a bit less than 11 seconds to make it look like the ship is braking harder here. Let's take another look at the sequence right now. For now, I am happy with the general layout. We could go even more in depth here and add a lot more keys if we wanted to, but there is another very powerful tool inside Sequencer that will make this tweaking process a lot easier. And that is the ability to actually animate with curves. For that, let's click this button to open up the curve editor. I'll dock it next to the sequencer here. Here you can see a similar tree view on the left and the curve area on the right. Right now we can see all the transform curves. The Y location, the Z location and the X location. And all the rotation values are a lot smaller than the location values, so they are right now bunched up near the 0 value. To move around in this curve view, what you can do is hold down right click and drag the view around. Scroll in and out to zoom in and out. Alt and right click to zoom in and out as well. Alt and shift and right click to zoom out in individual axes. A or F to focus your view. And that's pretty much it for the basics of navigation. Let's start the tweaking process by taking a look at the location curves. Looking at the curves, we can see that the trajectory starts with a parabolic downward slope. This means that at the beginning the ship is moving slower and then it starts to speed up. We can confirm this by taking a closer look at the starting section of our animation. Let's move the playhead back to the beginning. As we still have the ship selected, let's just press F to zoom our view there. Now, playing the animation back, we can see that our ship starts slowly and then speeds up, but should be instead slowing down throughout the whole process. There are several ways in which we can start mitigating this. First, we can change the way the interpolation is done. For that, we can left click on the keys and then right click on them and switch the interpolation modes. Auto uses cubic interpolation, User is cubic interpolation with user-defined tangents. Break is user-defined tangents that are not connected to each other. Linear is linear interpolation, and constant interpolation means that the value actually changes when we reach the next keyframe. And when using weighted tangents, we can actually change the amount of effect that the tangents themselves have. By still being in the default selection mode, shortcut key Q, let's select all these keys here for the X, Y, and Z axis. And let's change their interpolation type to be linear. The shortcut key for that is 4. Now our ship will start moving with a constant velocity at the very beginning. To move a group of keys, we can use the transform tool. The shortcut for that is W. Now we have much more flexibility in how we can move the keys. We can scale them from one side. We can scale them from one corner. We can translate all of them like we can in the default selection mode by pressing this middle area. And we can scale the keys to the middle by holding down Alt and left click and dragging. Ctrl Z to undo this. There's also this very useful read time tool. The shortcut for this is E. After having switched to this tool, we can see these 2 green vertical bars here. And by left clicking twice, we can add more. These bars form a lattice that transform all of the keys at once. All of the keys that are visible, that is. So if we also want to transform the rotation keys, we have to go up one level to the transform level itself. Now if we move one of these vertical lines, all of the keys between this line and the one next to it will transform smoothly according to this gradient. To re-demonstrate this, let's also move these keys. And let's move this back. Now we have this slowing down speed curve here. Let's take another look at our animation by navigating back to the beginning and pressing the play button. In this middle section here, the ship seemed to slow down too much for the angle it is banking at, or actually too little. So let's try fixing this by reorganizing our retime tool. Now let's move these back and these forward a little bit. And let's play the sequence again. Now the end seems a bit too fast, so I'll refine it a little bit more and take another look. Essentially, the whole process of animating boils down to this loop of making small adjustments and seeing how they work. This seems good enough for me for now, so I'll go back into the regular edit mode by pressing Q. Also, I noticed that my keys are out of my timeline, so I'll move them back to the 0 position. For that, I only want to move them in one axis. That is the time axis. We can do that by holding down Shift and starting moving in one direction, then they will all move in only that axis. We could have also entered the value here manually. Taking another quick look at the various options for tangents that are available to us. Let's press Ctrl W to go into the manual tangent mode. Now we can scale up and scale down the amount of influence that these tangents have. We can break them by pressing free. Now we can have sharp changes in velocity, like for example if a ball bounced on the ground. If I select the key again and press 1, it will go back to the auto tangents. Again, Ctrl W to control the amount of influence that the tangents have. 5 to get the constant value until the next keyframe. Actually, I'm going to be changing this back to 1 as this curve looks very nice. Now that we have our ship landing, let's add cameras to the sequence so that it becomes a proper cinematic. There are multiple ways that we can do that. We can drag in a camera actor from the modes panel. Note that there is a regular camera as well as cinematic cameras and camera rigs. Cinematic cameras have some extra options, so we want to use these for our sequence. Another option for adding the camera is pressing this camera button here. Before we do that, let's go back to the beginning of the sequence. Let's go to our ship, press F to focus on it. Let's add the camera. In addition to the camera itself being added, we also got the camera cuts track. We will get to that in a few moments. Before that, take a quick look at this cinematic camera actor. It has a small lightning icon next to it. This means that this camera is spawnable and only exists in the context of this cinematic. You can also convert the other objects to spawnables if you want. Also note that we are possessing the camera, meaning that if we move, the camera will move with us. We can exit this view by pressing this eject button. To repossess the camera, you can right click on the actor. It actually doesn't have to be just a camera, and press this pilot camera option here. Shortcut for this is Ctrl Shift and P. Also, before we start animating the transform of the camera, let's change our viewport to the cinematic viewport. For that, click this perspective button here and change our viewport type to cinematic. Now we can see that the punch here has changed. We got these two black bars on the top and on the bottom, and also a timeline view, so we can actually change our timeline straight from our viewport. It did eject us from our cinematic camera actor. We could find it again and use this pilot option, or what we can also do is press this lock camera to view button here. Let's go back to the first frame and let's position our camera. Let's add transform keys to it by selecting it and pressing S. Let's move forward. And add another key. And forward once more. And even more. I'll go through the process and add keys throughout the length of our cinematic. Now if we scrub through the timeline, let's see how it looks. Again, we can see that we start moving slowly, so let's fix that by selecting the transform key and pressing 4. The ability to change the tangent mode is also available in the default sequencer view here. Let's take a look again. Right here we are moving through the terrain, so let's go back to the previous key and let's move our camera up a little bit. Press S to save the changes. This is a little bit better, but we are not going to worry about this because for that duration we are actually going to be using another camera. Right now the camera orientation worked for me, but in some cases you might have instances where your camera will start flipping around, seemingly at random. The reason for that is due to the way that the animation is stored in the curves. Let's open up the rotation view here to demonstrate it. If you are in the default Euler rotation view, what might happen is that in some cases the keys here might get 360 degrees added to them to stay in this plus 180 to minus 180 range. So you might get flipping like this. To fix that, there's two options. You can change the key like I just did here to demonstrate this issue. But another way of avoiding it is going back into the sequencer, going into the rotation keys, right-clicking anywhere on the track that is not a key, going into properties, and using this use quaternion interpolation option for the rotation. This means that when interpolating from one key to the next, the shortest path is used, instead of trying to stick to this plus 180 to minus 180 range. But for me, this worked out nicely, so I don't have to do that. Let's go on and add the second camera to our cinematic. For that, let's exit the view of this camera. We can do that by pressing this button here again. And now let's actually move the back wing of this spaceship. This view here seems nice to have a GoPro style camera here. For that, let's press this camera button here to add another camera in here. And let's parent this to our ship hull. To make sure that the camera transform remains correct, let's also add an attach track to our cinematic camera actor. To add the attach track, click this add track button and select the ship hull from here. Now if we play it back, we can see our view from this camera and how it is attached to the ship here. Making our viewport bigger, we can also see that there is some depth of field going on, which right now works kind of like we would want it to. This is one of these properties that we can change with our camera. For that, let's make sure that we have our camera that we want to change selected, and let's expand the focus settings. Let's also enable the drawing of the debug focus plane. This will show us the plane at which the camera is focused at. Let's bring the value down. Now we can see that as the plane clips our ship mesh, this is the place at which the image is its sharpest. If I move it very close and disable this debug drawing, we can see that most of the frame is out of focus. Note that this is also a keyable value, and you can see that we can key this straight from the details panel. If changing the focus distance manually is too hard, we can also use this eyedropper tool here to pick a point that we want to be in focus. Also, if you want to, we can use tracking focus or no focus at all. We'll leave it as is for now and increase the aperture size to have a more pronounced depth of field effect. Let's also change the focal length of the camera. Having a lower value here means that we can see more of the scene, and having a higher value means that we can see less. In this case, 24 seems to work for me. Let's go back to our camera cuts track. In there we can define which camera is active at which point. Right now the first cinematic camera actor is the one that is used throughout the whole sequence, if we make this track active. But if we want to use our GoPro camera in some sections, then let's go back to the beginning, for example, and add another camera here, and let's choose the second cinematic camera actor that we added. This overrode the whole sequence with our new camera. But no worries, let's just move forward to the place that we want to cut that. Here, for example. And now let's choose the first camera here. Now when I scrub back and forth, I can see that the camera is automatically switched at this point. In this practice session, we are only doing this with the cameras, but you can have entire Saab sequences here instead. For that, you need to use the Saab scenes track. I'll leave the addition of the third camera up to you. Let's change a few more things. Let's exit our camera view. And let's actually animate the rotation of the engines. As the ship is pretty much flying straight up until to quite a late time in the sequence, let's go to that point. Let's select all the engines and let's add them to our cinematic. We can add all of them at once. Now let's navigate to the transform section in the details menu and change their orientation from here. -90 seems to be the correct value. Let's add a key for them by pressing S to note that I still had all of them selected. And now let's actually start animating them individually. For that, let's move the timeline along and repeat pretty much the same process that we had for the ship hull. But because the engines themselves are parented to the ship hull, we are doing the animation in local space. So now I'm just going into the rotation mode and going through here and adding keys to them. So at this point for this engine, maybe something like that. I could press S to add keys to all of the transform tracks, but because I know that I only want to change the orientation, I'm going to press Shift E instead. I'll repeat the process for the other engines as well. It seems that I oriented one engine in the wrong direction. I could go in and fix the keys, but in this case, because I only need the pitch track, I'm just going to get rid of the other tracks and zero the other ones out. Because I want to make this descent portion a little bit more interesting, I added a bit of idle animation to the engines at the very beginning here. And now what I'm actually going to do is copy the same keys that I created here once more to extend the animation throughout this whole section here. Alt, click and drag to duplicate the keys. Also, to make it a bit more random, I'm just going to move some of them forwards and backwards a little bit. Now let's take one final look at our animation. There are a bunch more additions and refining I could do, but I'll leave that to you if you do want to do that. Let's add one last small thing to our cinematic. Let's add a fade track. If the fade track has a value of 0, it means no fading is done. So let's go to 2 seconds. That is the point where I want the view to be faded in. Let's add a key here by pressing the plus button. And let's now go to the very beginning and let's change the value to be 1 and press enter to add a key here as well. Now when the cinematic starts, our view actually fades in from black. Let's also do the same to the ending of our cinematic. And now let's take an actual final look at our cinematic. That's it. Thank you.